Hey everyone, Brian here. Happy to welcome you to session 6 of our Renewal Works Bible study for 2022. This year we're looking at the history of salvation as our Eucharistic prayers understand it, especially looking at some of the stories that predate Jesus and his significant moment of salvation history for us as Christians. But our Eucharistic prayers now are really laying the foundation for that in many of the events that occurred prior to the life of Jesus and in the deep heritage of the covenant people of Israel. We've just looked at two amazing stories from what Jews call the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. The first being the saga of Abraham and Sarah in the book of Genesis, and the second, the early part of the relationship between Moses and the people of Israel as they escaped slavery in Egypt, and we left the story at Mount Sinai, where the 10 Commandments were given to Moses, and they are launched now as the new covenant community. A lot of great books and stories happen following that. I hope you'll get a chance to look at them sometime. They're among my favorite in all of Scripture. Once the people of Israel get to the Jordan River and they're ready to cross back into Canaan, where Abraham and Sarah first set foot many generations earlier, and to reclaim this land that God promised Abraham as their own now. The leadership is taken from Moses and passed on to Joshua, who's more of a military guy than Moses was. His stories are great. The next book is called the Book of Joshua. I'm sorry, well, that was the Book of Joshua, the Book of Judges. My all-time favorite book of the entire Bible. Tells the story of ancient Israel, how their charismatic leaders emerged. It's just fantastic. And we're always looking for how the people of God intersect with both the regular life they have to lead. They have to have a political organization, they have to have social structures, economic structures, political and legal structures. They have to have all these things. As I keep saying, Jesus keeps reminding his disciples, your Father in heaven knows you need these things. But how do you include or relate that to the ongoing relationship with the God of all creation? And that launches the rest of what we call the Old Testament and what Jews call the Tanakh. That is the entire Jewish Bible, both the Torah and then what is called the histories and the prophets, etc. So we're going now to launch to that next section that the Eucharistic prayers refer to as a part of the history of salvation, and it's called the words spoken through the prophets. Now, it's very important for us to understand that the prophets were not a group of mostly guys who sat around and said, what does God want people to know about the future? And they sort of, like meditated over a crystal ball or something and then wrote these long books about what the people of God ought to do or watch out for or whatever, and that those prophecies might still take place today. That's not what they did. These were real people living in the middle of real socioeconomic and political realities. And it was their purpose, uniquely, to make sure that as Israel and then the two countries of Israel and Judah became real nations, real power players in the region, with real structures like we would recognize in modern governments. As that happened, this whole category of prophets rose up to say, in all sorts of different situations, under all sorts of different kings, in different political realities, that the people of God had to remember God in their midst, and that once you acquired political power all by yourself, then you can easily forget God, something we should and do, I hope, remember very much in the modern world where we feel very self self-sufficient, and in many ways are. And so it's the work of the church, in that sense, to be prophetic. How is it that God still needs to be interactive in a world where we have our own democracy, our own economic system, our own way of well-being that's built into socioeconomic and political realities? And that's what the prophets did. So our first look at prophets this time round is from the second book of Samuel. The first book of Samuel, by the way, takes us back to that transition between the period of the judges, that time when charismatic leaders bubbled up when people needed it, or needed some judicial oversight, or a war leader at a particularly challenging or difficult time. And then finally, the people of Israel wanted a more stable government like the city-states that were around them, so they asked for a king. It's very important for us to understand that prophets are always speaking into relationship with this desire of the ancient Israelite people to move out of their nomadic way of governing themselves, in which they could still understand themselves as having Yahweh as their king, but having charismatic leaders, elders, tribal leaders, and et cetera, to hold the 12 tribes together, but not have a highly structured political system. But eventually they felt if they were going to continue to thrive and live in that land, that they would need to come back to this time and create for themselves a more structured government with their own king at the top. The prophets are always in relationship to these monarchies and this highly sophisticated political and social system. In it, they say you have lost the idea that Yahweh is your king, or Yahweh is the center of your life. You've lost the covenant relationship, and you've become just satisfied with the socio-political system that you've created, even if God himself called the first couple of kings. So, to begin with, we're going to be here in the second book of Samuel, and we're going to see the very first time that this relationship between a king on the one hand and a prophet on the other hand occurs. It's important for us to see this story because while it's a famous story and one well known to most of us, it's the archetype, it's the way to understand all the subsequent prophecies, that they have to do with either a single king or an entire elite group within either Israel or Judah who have learned how to count on themselves rather than continuing to count on the joy and beauty of being in covenant relationship with a God who admittedly they cannot see and they don't all hear because they're not attuned to this deep voice within. We also want to watch for the fact that these are people who do listen for that deep voice within, who have that perhaps more natural capacity to know what the voice of the divine is saying, and to do as Abraham did, which is to discern that voice as separate from other multitudes of voices that are going on inside, and to know that God cares deeply for the historic situation his people are in, and wants once again, over and over and over again, to bring people into that balance of life between the everyday needs and the everyday actions and decisions we make, and the never-ending reality that our lives are completely interlaced with the glory of God at work, and that it's the job of the covenant people not only to live that way for themselves, but to be a beacon for other people to see how they could choose to make a life the same way. What the prophets say is that essentially the famous phrase, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we will see that in the story of David and Nahum. David is this amazing, charismatic king, half, a little bit like the judges who came before him, very charismatic. People love him. And God anoints him as the first king of a united Israel and Judah. Saul, before him, attempted to do it, but could never quite get everybody together, and David manages it. So he's the very first king, and Nahum becomes the very first prophetic voice. So I encourage you and really hope you'll get into this story, this dynamic story that goes on between David and Nahum around David's lust for Bathsheba. And realize that this dialogue between somebody who's very much in power and called upon to live and lead the covenant people with a deep sense of that covenant relationship, and how that can go askew, and then, of course, how it can be brought back, how reconciliation can occur, and how God and even a leader who's gone astray can find their way back together again. It's that rhythmic story that we're going to see over and over again through all the prophets. And it's important for us to understand their historic reality so that we understand what they were trying to say to the original kings of Judah or Israel when they spoke, so that we can understand that that message is still important today. So it's a very fun story. I hope you enjoy it, and God bless.